Well, it's wonderful to be here, and I just want to start by congratulating Gabrielle and the whole team for putting together this really wonderful design of this conference of so many different participants and stakeholders, and I really hope it recurs more frequently. So I'm going to talk about really some thoughts on the relationship between soil carbon and soil health, gleaned from 15 or 20 years of working with farms and working with farming systems, primarily organic farms, but not exclusively, in eastern Canada. And this is just, yet again, what you've been hearing the last few days, just the global perspective on this, how estimates of different management, best management practices, whether you're talking rangeland, whether you're talking cropping systems, degraded land can improve the soil carbon storage and help reduce and help mitigate climate change, and how important that role is, because we really can't get to our Paris climate change goals with just energy improvements alone, and that's well recognized. But at the same time, we are increasingly aware of the impact on agriculture on all ecosystems, and the often negative impact of agriculture on biodiversity, on pollution with excess nitrogen, excess phosphorus as well, now into essentially all ecosystems. And the call by many players, both large industry groups internationally, IPNI, FAO, UNEP, on some redesign or transformation of agriculture into some form of ecological intensification. Organic agriculture globally as well, and there's been speakers here on that, have targeted in its next iteration climate change, biodiversity, and soil conservation and soil health as primary focuses of the next redesign of organic agriculture. But when we talk about intensification, I've always thought, well, measured how? How do we measure intensification? If you're dealing with an individual farm or farming system or group of farmers, are you looking at energy efficiency? Are you looking at employment? Are you looking at water use and efficiency, nutrient loading, nutrient surplus, nutrient efficiency? And rarely talked about is sort of the carbon flow through the farming system. And that's really, I think, the thing we have to change. We're very good at measuring all the others, and I've participated in that, but only recently wondered about how can we really track the sort of carbon intensification, if we can put it that way. And is it useful to talk about organic versus conventional, those kind of comparisons, or is some form of spectrum of intensity across organic and across conventional more useful metric in going forward? We've certainly noticed and documented that even within organic farming in Canada, there's quite a range of energy efficiency. And here I'm talking about life cycle energy efficiency. If we look at the whole farm, everything, the embedded energy brought into the farm, the export off the farm of products, and we look at the global warming footprint, we can see a spectrum even within organic farming of energy efficiency. Generally, it's much lower than conventional. The energy footprint and global warming footprint, but it varies. Also, even in a study of 12 organic livestock farms in Ontario, we found the livestock density and the nutrient surplus really ranged across those farms, and that's very often related to greenhouse gas footprint as well, the nitrogen surplus per hectare or per product as well. So quite a range of intensity, even within organic. But the context also in eastern Canada is, and this is just a graph of up to 2011, I think it would extend. This is the Ontario Ministry tracking the increase in annual cropping and the reduction in perennial crops. So the intensification of use of annual cropping, and often annual crops that have low residues, as what Maria was just talking about, the low residues of soybean. You really see it in terms of, even with a no-till system, you really see the decrease in soil carbon. So this is the context of and by estimates by Agriculture Canada, this this change is depleting soil carbon in Ontario. And we've heard speakers yesterday talk about this is probably the case in Quebec as well. In Atlantic Canada, we have one of the sort of classic low residue crops, potatoes grown intensively on large acreages with a high degree of soil disturbance. So it's a really challenge to maintain soil organic matter with potatoes in the production system. And Prince Edward Island has a remarkable database they monitored 300 sites, soil quality sites, for the last 20 years, and they sample those sites every 3 years. And the most recent data from that monitoring shows a decrease of 0.05, and that's 0.05% against a total of about 2%. So it's decreasing quite dramatically, the organic matter on average. In other words, in another 20 years, they'll be down to 1% organic matter and below that if we were to keep with that level of degradation and loss of organic matter. So just simply put it, the balance of carbon in soil, it's the net effect of management that really we're monitoring. And that's the balance of the rate of return or of residues to soil, depending on the cropping system and the rotation, versus the decomposition of that carbon by mineralization and tillage usually. But also influencing the net balance is some aspect of the soil itself. Not all soils are the same, and different soils have different capacities to store carbon and soil organic matter. It's not an unlimited capacity, in other words. The depth of the soil, and we're starting to consider how we can monitor that more closely. Is that lower soil organic matter more truly stored than the turnover in the surface, which is more dynamic? But that's talking about total soil carbon. What's the relationship to soil health? And can we have it both? Can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we store carbon in soil and lock it away, but also use the carbon, have it flow through the ecosystem, if you like to think of it, and promote soil quality, soil biology, respiration, loss of CO2, promote soil health? Can we do both? And this was very nicely captured, this apparent dilemma was very nicely captured in a paper by Henry Janssen, shown here at his research station in Agriculture Canada in Lethbridge. And Henry is a true soil scientist and a poet on the topic of soil carbon, a wonderful speaker, and he's also been involved in the International Panel on Climate Change, so he knows the global perspective as well. But I recommend this short paper on this question of can we, and I'll try and answer that with some data we're collecting. So just to go back to organic systems, do they promote soil carbon? Well, this is looking at long-term studies, 12 years, 20 years in Canada and some from North America that I summarized. And overall, I would say it doesn't indicate one way or the other whether organic totally increases soil carbon or not. Others, colleagues in the organic world around the world, would disagree with me. They say, oh, I'm not so sure, maybe it's a net gain. But I think what's more interesting is the real evidence that organic definitely promotes soil health generally. And that has to be considered as well. And there's much more persuasive data on the sort of labile fractions, as we call it, the active fractions of organic matter under organic management. And I'll indicate why. So how do we measure the active organic matter, the stuff that's the organisms are feeding on, and how can we possibly track that? Well, there's some established techniques. Just to summarize some of the things we do, you can sieve off a kind of the new organic matter going into soil, the recently decomposed material, the roots, so it's a physical separation of active organic matter. You can do a chemical technique, and you can do respiration. You can ask the microbes, put it in soil, measure the CO2, and say, well, are you finding more new material, more active material in soil? You could measure the microbial biomass, take soil into the lab, and do a sort of fumigation and measure the microbial biomass. So there's different techniques to look at that. But so how does organic systems possibly promote particularly soil health? Well, the vegetative diversity, it's very well documented that if one thing that organic does, it really promotes vegetative diversity. And when you talk to organic farmers and they say, yes, I know, it's called weeds. But it's actually more interesting than that. And you don't have to ask sort of perhaps biased agronomists. You can ask excellent ecologists, such as Céline Boutin from Eastern Canada, who's gone out and looked in comparisons in wonderful studies in top journals, looked at the floral diversity on comparative organic and conventional farms, and the number of native and exotic plant species, etc. So just there's some wonderful data on this kind of thing. But that kind of diversity, spatial and temporal diversity of longer rotations as well on organic farms, not necessarily the weeds, in some cases, have wider ecosystem services. You get more ground beetle diversity. So soil health, we have to think of then, that promotes young songbird food biomass, etc. And this has been documented in the Eastern Canada context. So again, that's linking soil and biodiversity globally and ecosystem services. So I'm going to switch to one study we did with long rotations of potato farms. So this was 4 organic potato farms in PEI, which had long rotations, 5-year rotations. The lettering here is the potato phase, the grain phase, so then they went into wheat or barley, and then that was undersown to a forage of red clover or alfalfa and left there for 3 or 4 years, or 3 years. And that's very unusual. A 5-year rotation compared to their conventional neighbors, they would be at most into a 3-year rotation, in many cases sometimes shorter than that, potatoes and back into potatoes, because it's the high value crop. But organic farmers are getting a premium for their potatoes, so they could afford to have these much longer rotations. And I just, sorry about the numbers there, but the takeaway here is that if we measured total organic carbon, we saw no difference across the rotation. We were really interested in the dynamics in the 5-year rotation in the soil. What was really changing and really responding to the rotation phases, as we call it, was the sort of living fraction of the soil, the earthworms abundance, and the microbial fraction, the bacteria and the fungi really responded to this extended rotation. And I'll just graph that. Here's the potato year. So we measured it 2 years. We were able to go back onto all the farms and say, where was potatoes last year, where was grain last year, where was forages last year, and track it over 2 years and 4 farms. And what you see is, yes, the big disturbance, low residue potato year. Even on an organic farm, earthworm numbers are really depleted. But with that long rotation, you get a boom and bust cycle. You get a recovery of the earthworm population, up to 4 million earthworms per hectare. Very similar numbers to the adjacent perennial pasture. So it's a kind of, and this was happening whether you measure it as biomass. So that's a big nutrient pool, a big biomass pool that's cycling in the system because you have a more complex temporal dynamic of a cropping system. But interestingly too, the bacteria and fungi, the percent of the total organic matter as bacteria and fungi is really following the same dynamic as the earthworms. So in other words, it introduces the idea again, just reaffirms that idea of we can track some things, indicator pools more readily than total carbon as influenced by short-term changes in farming systems. And it's well documented as well as a result of that kind of increased temporal spatial diversity of cropping on organic farms, you have better soil resilience, and we can measure that. Here's our little rainfall simulator where we can expose the soil to sort of 5 minutes of intense rainfall and see does the structure hold up, do the aggregates resist, and lots of studies have showed that on an organic farm that's certainly the case. And they also perform generally better as we increase the organic matter, we increase the water holding capacity of the soil, and we can measure that as well. But an additionally interesting aspect of soil resilience is the inherent resilience of the microbial community in the soil as well. And it's become much more possible to track some of this in recent years and use molecular techniques to look at the change in the microbial community and the functioning of the microbial community after long-term management of different farming systems. Organic farming, it's really well documented, especially in the North American context, is very low in phosphorus inputs, to the point where one would say it's a really almost phosphorus deficient system. Certainly some agronomists would feel that this is possibly its weakest link in terms of sustainability. But what was really interesting to track for Tandra Fraser, who did her PhD on this work, was how that the microbial community responded in it and was resilient to that change. Even though the diversity of the microbial community changed, the functioning, the adaptation of the microbial community to those low input conditions, low phosphorus input conditions, was remarkable. I think the question now for us is, what's the resilience of the soil to low carbon inputs in conventional systems? And that's a really interesting question. What's the lowest threshold for carbon inputs, and how much can the soil resist that challenge? We've challenged it with low phosphorus in organic, and we see some resilience. We also see the mycorrhizae, the fungal community. These were comparing conventional forage fields in Ontario with organic, long-term organic, and the mycorrhizal community responds to low phosphorus conditions in an adaptive way. Just to flag a couple of other related studies that are going on at the moment. So Carolyn Marshall is looking at no-till management of green manures, and some of you may have encountered this system that was popularized by Rodale. It actually originated in Brazil, but this concept of, instead of tilling a green manure, crimping it and rolling it, so you terminate it, you stop its further growth in the fall with some kind of heavy machinery that has a crimping action to it, to the stem, and so you terminate the green manure, but it's still there as a mulch, and a serious mulch the next spring, and it's a mulch over winter. So what's the effect of that approach to green manure management on some of the things I've been talking about in terms of soil carbon, soil health, earthworms, and she's also looking at beetle diversity as well. This system has been picked up by conventional growers as well in eastern Canada, vegetable producers rolling rye and crimping rye and planting cucumbers and other crops and keeping the soil covered over winter. So an idea of approaching green manures without necessarily having to consider tillage. Morgan McNeil is doing a master's to look at the effect of different green manures, whether it's oats and hairy vetch, a very novel, very productive, nitrogen-fixing green manure in the Eastern Canada context, versus the traditional red clover. What's the effect of that going into a grain crop, into wheat and then soybeans, and then if you leave the weeds or not? What's the relative contribution of weeds? Now that's a lot of weeds, corn spurry and other weeds, but what's the relative contribution of weeds to soil carbon, to soil health, to soil diversity, to ecosystem function? In our recent project, the Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Project, funded by Agriculture Canada, myself and colleague Dr. Burton, who's here, have a project over the next 5 years to assess the cropping systems, all cropping systems in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island for soil health, soil carbon storage capacity, and soil end supply as relates to greenhouse gas emissions. And the area I'm interested in that project is that, again, that relationship between total carbon and soil health. And there's some aspect with this much larger sampling of farms. We sampled almost 1,000 fields last fall across the two provinces. Can we come up with a metric of management intensity as relates to sort of carbon in and out of that farming system? And we'll relate that back to the soil type and soil storage capacity and soil depth, etc. So I'll just show one more slide, and this links back to Henry's dilemma of, can we have it all? Can we store carbon, and can we increase the active carbon as well? And sorry about the acronyms again, that's the particulate organic matter, so that's just measuring one of the active pools of organic matter. And here's total carbon. So just across some of the fields we sampled last fall, it looks encouraging that as total carbon goes up, the percent of the active goes up. So it goes up 30, 40%. So in other words, in response to Henry, it looks like, yes, we can. We can store carbon and have a very dynamic contribution to soil health as well. That they're in equilibrium, really, and it's possible. And this just shows that that fraction, that particulate fraction, the microbes like it as well. As there's more of it, they respire and respond to it as well. So in summary, I think maintaining and enhancing soil carbon while enhancing soil health and resilience is an achievable, and a critical goal. But I think we need practical tools to look at farming systems, no longer just in terms of their nutrient management, even energy use. We need to look at it in terms of their carbon footprint in a very comprehensive way as relates to soil carbon storage, biodiversity, and soil health as well. Well, that's it. Thanks.